Hey there, I'm Tatiana Mejia, passionate traveler and about cooking, and I found a way to blend my two greatest loves by creating the first gastronomic tourism agency in Latin America. Welcome to Bites and Sides, where we travel by eating and eat by traveling. In this space, I'll take you on a journey to discover gastronomic tourism, a one-of-a-kind way to explore the world through its flavors, traditions, and local communities. There are some foods that become almost invisible simply because they are part of our everyday lives. We see them at breakfast, lunch, family gatherings, and celebrations, yet we rarely stop to think about the stories they carry, the people who has preserved the recipes, or how they survive through generations. That's exactly what has happened with the arepa. For generations, it has been part of everyday life for millions of Colombians. And yet, for a long time, it has been as nothing more than a traditional food. It was always on our tables, yeah, but rarely part of the conversation about heritage, identity, or culinary history. Only in recent decades has it begun to receive the attention of researchers, chefs, institutions, and people dedicated to documenting the rich cultural heritage behind it. That is why this episode isn't about deciding which region makes the best arepa or setting the debate about its originate. Instead, it's about showing how an everyday food can become one of the most powerful expressions of a country's history, diversity, and identity. Talking about the arepa also means talking about biodiversity. It means recognizing that Colombia doesn't have just one kind of arepa, but hundreds of different varieties made with corn, plantains, cassava, rice, jam, and many other local ingredients. Each one reflects the unique relationship between people and the land they call home. Every arepa is the result of centuries of adaptation, creativity, and knowledge passed down from one generation to the next. This episode is also a tribute to the people who has have helped us better understand this remarkable heritage. Researchers like Julian Estrada Ochoa opened an important conversation through anthropology and food history, showing that the arepa deserves to be studied as a cultural expression. More recently, Jose Luis Rivera Researches has documented more than 450 varieties of arepa across Colombia, and studies like The Flavor That Brings Colombians Together, published by Bancolombia in 2024, confirm the important role the arepa plays in Colombia's national identity. But this story is also deeply personal. When I began traveling across Colombia between 2003 and 2008 to document its traditional cuisines, I realized that food is one of the best ways to truly understand a place. That experience led me to create Astu Viaje Gourmet, and ever since, the arepa has been part of almost every journey we have designed as a way to help travelers understand Colombia's incredible cultural diversity through our experiences and our flavor of Colombia's boxes. We have always wanted both Colombian and international travelers to do more than simply taste an arepa. We want them to understand the story behind it. But this episode, it's not only about looking back, it's also about asking what we need to do to make sure this heritage continues to thrive. Because protecting the arepa isn't just about preserving a recipe. It means supporting the farmers who protect traditional seeds, recognizing the cooks who keep this traditional alive, encouraging more research, promoting public policies that value culinary heritage, and understanding that food tourism can be a powerful way to document, preserve, and create opportunities for local communities. That's that's the purpose of this episode, to invite you to see the arepa in a different way, not simply as an everyday food, but as a living heritage that tells the story of Colombia. And as long as the knowledge continues to be passed from one generation to the next, it will continue to remind us who we are. There are flavors we simply enjoy, others nourish us, but a few have the remarkable ability to take us back in time, awaking memories, reminding us who we are, and connect us to a place. That's the power of food. And that's exactly why I decided to dedicate my life to food tourism. When I decided to start a travel company, I knew I didn't want to do everyone else was doing. Colombia already offered nature, adventure, beautiful beaches, vibrant cities, and incredible culture. But I wanted something different, something that will allow people to experience a place on a much deeper level. That's when I realized something that had actually been with me since childhood. My two greatest passions had always been traveling and eating. They were never separated passions. They were simply two different ways of discovering the world. Over the time, I came to understand that eating is about much more than satisfying hunger. Food has the power to bring back memories, teach us history, connect us with people, and tell the story of a place in ways that no book ever could. That's why, and that is how, my passion for food tourism began, long before it became an important part of travel industry in Latin America. In the early 2000s, when food tourism was still a relative unknown concept across the region, I began traveling throughout Colombia and other countries. I had no idea those journeys would completely change the way I understood the places I visited. I started traveling with one question in my mind: what flavor truly represents a place? Well, that question led me to countries like Chile, Argentina, and Peru, where it was easy, very easy, to identify foods that had become part of each nation's identity. Chile had its wines and seafood. Argentina had its famous barbecue. Peru had ceviche. Okay, but when I returned to Colombia, the country where I was born and raised, I found myself facing the hardest question of all. What flavor brings Colombians together? The answer wasn't so simply, because Colombia is incredible diverse. I could say, well, it was bandeja paisa, okay, because that dish mainly represents one region, Antioquia. It couldn't be ajiaco because it belongs to Bogota and the surrounding Cundinamarca region. Nor could it be fried fish served with coconut rice and patacones because that reflects the Caribbean coast. Each of those dishes tells the story of a particular place, but none of them could fully represent the extraordinary diversity of Colombia. That's when I realized I needed to look differently at something I had seen all my life, but had never truly noticed. From that moment on, the way I travel completely changed. I stopped simply visiting places. I started talking with farmers. I stepped into family kitchens. I shared meals with indigenous, Afro Colombian, and rural communities. I watched people cook. I asked about their harvest. I listened to stories shared around the wood burning stove. And little by little, I began noticing something that appeared everywhere I went. There was one food that was always there, yet it was never exactly the same. At first, it seemed like like a coincidence. I would arrive in one region and there was an arepa. Okay, an arepa. Then I traveled somewhere else and, well, there was another arepa. Then another one that looked completely different. Yeah, arepa. And another and another. Some were grilled over an open fire. Others were fried. Some some were steamed. Others were wrapped in bijao leaves before cooking. Some were thin. Others were thick. Some were made with no salt or fat at all, simply humble foods that reflected everyday life. Others were filled with cheese, meat, crispy pork, or ingredients that spoke of each region's abundance. But what surprised me the most came next. Like many Colombians, I had grown up believing that an arepa was simply something made from corn. Yeah, I thought it. Until the country itself showed me I was totally wrong. I found arepas made, yeah, with corn, with white corn, with yellow corn, with purple corn, that is cariaco, but I also discovered arepas made with ingredients unique to each region. And that completely changed the way I understood Colombian cuisine. I realized that the richness of an arepa isn't found only in the corn. Its true richness lies in the land itself. Every harvest shaped a different recipe. Every community developed its own techniques. Every landscape left its mark on what seems at first glance to be such a simple food. As I kept traveling, answering one question became harder and harder. Which one is the Colombian arepa? Today, my answer is very simple. All of them. Because talking about the Colombian arepa as if we're only one overlooks an extraordinary diversity that it has been shaped over centuries by indigenous, Afro Colombian, and rural communities across every corner of the country. Growing up, the arepas I knew were the ones from Santander: arepa de maíz pelado, arepa with mozzarella cheese, arepa de tela. To me, those were simply arepas. They were part of our everyday life, the kind of food that was always on the table for breakfast, as an afternoon snack, and often with lunch or dinner. And because they were such a normal part of daily life, I never stopped to think about the incredible story behind them. Wow. That's often what happens with heritage. When we see something every day, we stop not noticing it. It becomes invisible. But once I started traveling across Colombia, I realized that what I had taken for granted my entire life was only a small piece of something much bigger. Every trip brought a new surprise. Just when I thought I had discovered enough varieties, I found another one, then another one, and then, wow, another one. Eventually, I started inviting people to do a simple exercise. It's very simple. One that I like to invite you to do right now. So, are you ready? Think about all the different kinds of arepas you know. Make a list in your mind. How many can you name? Three? Five? No, seven. Wow, 10? Most Colombians can name, well, between four or five. People who know a lot about the subject might come about with around 10. I thought I knew quite a few myself, but during those first years of field work, I came across more than 75 different kinds of arepa. 75 different kinds of arepa. Can you imagine that? That's when I realized there was a much bigger story behind this humble food that most of us had never imagined. Over time, I also realized that researchers were beginning to ask the same questions. One of the pioneers was anthropologist Julian Estrada Ochoa, who helped transform the way we think about the arepa. It was no longer just an everyday food. It became recognized as a cultural expression, one capable of telling the story of our regions, our communities, and our identity. That shift in perspective was incredibly important because the moment we stop asking only how an arepa is made and begin asking how it's made that way, who first taught that recipe, and what place it represents, we begin to understand that we're talking about living heritage. In years that follow, many other researchers continue expanding that conversation. One of the most remarkable efforts has been the work of Jose Luis Rivera, who has traveled across Colombia documenting traditional arepas. Today, his research includes more than 450 different recipes, a number that will almost certainly continue to grow because Colombia's traditional kitchens are still very much alive and there is still much left to document. More than the number itself, what amazed me it was what it what it represents. More than 450 different ways of understanding a place, more than 450 stories, more than 450 ways of preserving Colombia's collective memory. And once I realized that the arepa was the invisible thread connecting the entire country, another question inevitable came up. You may be thinking about it right now. I know. But aren't the arepas from Venezuela too? The answer is yes. But I like to share a thought that I believe is really important. Flavors don't belong to countries, they belong to places. Too often we turn food into something to argue about, when it should actually be an opportunity to better understand the story we share. Take ceviche, for example. It's not found only in Peru. It's also part of a culinary tradition of Ecuador, Chile, Colombia, and other places from the Pacific countries. Yet, no one will deny that. For Peruvians, ceviche is one of the strongest symbols of their national identity. The same is true of barbecue. Argentina certainly isn't the only country that grills meat. Well, do you agree with me? But spend a little time there and you'll quickly understand that barbecue asado argentino is part of the country's culture. It's how families gather, celebrate, and connect around the table. The arepa tells a similar story. It is part of the history and identity of different regions across Northern South America. But in Colombia, it evolved into an extraordinary variety of preparations that reflect our biodiversity, our crops, and the many different ways people have learned to live with the land. That's why I never felt the need to argue about who owns the arepa or any food. I'd rather ask a different question. What does the arepa tell us about who we are? Because in the end, the most meaningful food aren't the ones that divide us. They are the ones that bring us together. The foods shared during family conversation, the ones that appear at celebrations, the ones prepared patiently over a wood burning stove, the recipes a grandmother teaches her granddaughter without ever writing them down. The flavors that can take us back to childhood with just one bite. That's the beautiful power of food. It nourishes our body, but it also nourishes our souls. Those questions stay with me. So I kept traveling. Every place taught me something new. Every traditional cook opened another door to understanding the incredible diversity of Colombia. Over the years, I realized that simply documenting how many kinds of arepas existed wasn't enough. What truly mattered were the stories behind each one, because none of them came into being by chance. Every arepa began with a harvest, with a landscape, with a climate, with the creativity and resourcefulness of a community. And that made every journey another opportunity to be surprised. Even today, I continue discovering preparations I'd never seen before, and honestly, I hope that never changes because it means our traditional cuisines are still alive, still evolving, still adapting, and still passing knowledge from one generation to the next. One of all of those experiences, there are there are two arepas I always think about whenever someone asks me the same two questions. Well, Tatiana or Tato, that's the way people likes to talk about me. Tatiana or Tato. What's your favorite arepa? And then comes the next one. What's the most unusual arepa you have ever tried? Well, it really makes me smile. Is the answer is reminds me it in a in the same place, La Guajira. This is a region that never stops surprising me, not only because of its breathtaking landscape, because of its extraordinary food traditions, many of which are still largely unknown. My favorite is, without a doubt, the chichihuare arepa, made with purple corn, the cariaco. That beautiful purple corn gives it a unique flavor And when it's combined with coconut and cheese, the result it's simply unforgettable. I still remember the first time I tasted. One bite, okay, I'll leave it. No, another bite. And I immediately wanted another one and another one. And do you have another arepa? It's one of those recipes I recommended over and over again, not just because it isn't delicious, just because it tells the story of a place, its crops, and the families who have kept the tradition alive. But La Guajira also gave me one of the most unexpected food experiences of my life. Actually, I was there on a field trip for a completely different reason. I wanted to learn about the region's traditional vinegars, and I visited the organic farms in southern Guajira. Instead, I came across a dish I never would have expected. Well, it was an arepa filled with cheese and crispy corn. Okay? Everything seemed to be familiar. But then came the surprise. It was served with a sauce called surraspa, a rich stew made from pork offal. I have to admit, when they placed it in front of me, I wasn't sure what to expect. The flavor was unlike anything I had ever tasted. And that's what exactly made it so unforgettable. Because traveling through food also means being willing to leave you the flavor, well, was unlike anything I had ever tasted. And that's exactly what made it so unforgettable. Because traveling through food also means being willing to leave your assumptions behind and allowing every place to teach you its own way of understanding food. That's what I love most about traveling. I never know what story I'll discover next around someone's cooking fire. And that's where I learned another lesson that has stayed with me ever since. Colombia's culinary richness isn't found only in its most famous dishes. It's found above all in the recipes that are still prepared every single day by local communities, even if they never appear in cookbooks or social media or in traditional travel guides. There's was, however, one question that kept coming up, and I would like to let you know it also. People often tell me this. Well, Tatiana, but people in the Amazon region don't eat arepas. Really? That's what you think? Every time I hear that, I smile because Colombia always finds a way to surprise us. My answer is always the same. Actually, they do. It just has a different name and it's made from a different crop. One of the greatest lessons food tourism has taught me is that if we want to understand a cuisine, we first have to understand the land where it comes from. We can't expect a country as biodiverse as Colombia to prepare the same foods everywhere. Start from it. Every landscape offers different ingredients, and every community has spent cooking with different ingredients, learning how to transform what nature provides into food. That's exactly what I discovered in the Amazon region. There, I had the opportunity to follow a food tradition from its very beginning. The experience started in the chagra. That chagra is that traditional family garden where indigenous community grow much of the food they eat and where every plant plays an important role in maintaining the balance of the ecosystem. So, that's where I learned about Yuca brava, bitter cassava. Many people know its name, maybe you. Very few understand the remarkable ancestral knowledge required to transform it into something safe to eat. Later, we return to the home of one of the community's grandmothers. And that's where I truly understood the depth of that knowledge. The process began by carefully extracting the liquid from the cassava, a crucial step because it is in its natural state, bitter cassava is toxic. Only after that careful process can it become safe to eat. It wasn't a simple recipe. It was knowledge passed down through countless generations, knowledge that demands patience, precision, and deep respect from nature. Only then did the preparation of cassave. Yeah, cassave is the traditional cassava flatbread that is the Amazon region arepa. As I watched those experiences hands at work, I realized I was witnessing another version of the same story I had been discovering throughout Colombia. Yeah, because cassave also speaks about the land. It speaks about harvest. It speaks about identity. And it reflects a community ability to transform what grows around them into a food that was sustaining them from centuries. That day, I confirmed something I had been sensing for years. Colombia doesn't taste like just one arepa. Colombia tastes like hundreds of arepa. And when I say arepas, I'm not referring only to those made with corn. I'm talking about every traditional flatbread born from the relationship between people and the land. Foods made from whatever each region provides to nourish families and preserve culture. That's why I like to say that in Colombia, every corner of the country has its own arepa. And perhaps the most remarkable part is that many people living in those places don't even realize the incredible diversity that exists right in their own communities. Yeah, as those first journeys continue, everything I had observed simply by listening, asking questions, and spending time with local communities began to be supported by academic research. Jose Luis Rivera's work, which has now documented more than 450 varieties of arepa across Colombia, confirms what many of us who had spent years exploring traditional kitchens had long suspected. That diversity is truly extraordinary, and studies like the flavors that brings Colombia's together presented by Bancolombia in 2024 also confirm something that became one of the greatest discoveries of my early travels. The arepas isn't just one of Colombia's most traditional foods. It may be well the flavor that best represent the country diversity and identity. And that makes me incredible happy, not because I prove what I was right, but because it reminds us how important it is to observe, to research, and above all, to listen to local communities before drawing conclusions. The answers are already there. We have just to learn. We just have to learn to ask the right questions. When I look back, I realized the arepa had always been part of my life. Every day, I grew up eating arepas for breakfast. I'd been having them for afternoon snacks. And of course, they were often part of lunch or dinner too. In my family, there are there was always an arepa on the table, and I'm sure the same is true in many Colombian homes. But like so many things that become part of our daily routine, there came as a point when I stopped not noticing them. They were simply there. They had become invisible, totally invisible. It wasn't only until I began traveling across Colombia that I truly discovered them again. Not in a museum, not in a book, but sitting around a wood burning stove, listening to a traditional cook explain why she used one variety of corn instead of another, walking alongside a family as they harvest their ingredients, learning that a recipe doesn't begin in the kitchen. It begins long before that, in the soil, in the seeds, and in the hands of the people who grow them. That's when I understood that the arepa is much more than food. It's a way of reading the landscape. Every arepa told me about a different place, a different harvest, a different community, a different way of understanding life. I discovered that flavors can become a doorway into the history of a people without even realizing it. That way of seeing the world became the foundation for how we start designing experiences at As to Viaje Gourmet. We stop asking ourselves which places travelers should visit. Instead, we began asking a different question, and a really flavor question. What story do we want people to understand through food? It was no longer enough for someone to simply taste an arepa. What mattered was what they learned, who grew the corn, who had preserved the recipe through generation, and why that particular arepa could only exist in that specific place. Eventually, we realized that experience didn't have to end when the journey was over. That philosophy inspired us on the flavor boxes. And I would like to tell you a little bit more about the Colombian box, the As tu Viaje Colombian box flavor. That one is created because we select different ingredients, traditional recipes, and products that represent the country's extraordinary culinary heritage. We also have it in the other regions from Argentina, Chile, and Peru. But today I'll let you know a little bit more about Colombian boxes because traveling doesn't always require getting on a plane. Sometimes all it takes is preparing a traditional recipe, learning where an ingredient comes from, or sharing a meal around the table to begin discovering a place. And that journey of learning what never really ended. To this day, I continue traveling across Colombia. I continue stepping into kitchens. I continue talking with traditional cooks, farmers, fishermen, and local communities who generously remind me that behind every recipe lies a story far greater, than what we can imagine. Because a recipe never begins in the kitchen. It begins in the earth, in the seeds, and in the hands of the people who plant them, care for them, and pass the knowledge from one generation to the next. When I look back now, I realize I was never really searching from the arepa. I really was searching from the flavor for the flavor that could tell the story of my country, of Colombia, of Peru, of Argentina, of Peru, of every place that I have visited. But today I'm talking about my country, Colombia. And time after time, the country itself kept leading me back to it. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson this journey has taught me. The things we see every day can become totally invisible. I grew up eating arepas. They were always right in front of me, but it wasn't until I chose to look at something familiar with fresh eyes that I discovered what had been there all along. The arepa was never just a food. It was the answer the land had been giving me all those years to a question I had been asking all along. Today, we explore much more than the story of a single food. We discovered that the arepa reflects Colombia's incredible biodiversity, the creativity of its communities, the wisdom of its traditional kitchens, and the quiet dedication of the people who have kept this heritage alive generation after generation. We also learned that the arepa isn't just part of the past, it continues to evolve, it continues to tell new stories, and it continues to invite us to discover Colombia's through its landscapes, its ingredients, and the people behind every recipe. I hope that after listening to this episode, the next time you have an arepa in front of you, you won't see just another meal. I hope you'll see the journey it took to reach your table, the hands that grew its ingredients, the cooks who preserve the knowledge behind it, and the communities that continue to protect such an important part of Colombia's identity. There is a lot of people and a lot of things involved because preserving our culinary heritage isn't only the responsibility of researchers, institutions, or governments. It starts with each one of us when we choose local products, when we support traditional cooks, when we travel with respect for local communities, and when we understand that every recipe carries a story worth listening to and worth sharing. If this episode sparked your curiosity, I invite you to share it with someone who loves discovering the stories behind the food we eat. Help me inspire more people to see that travel is also a way to learn, preserve memories, and celebrate the culinary heritage of the places we visit. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to Bites and Sides. Leave a review on your favorite podcast platform and let me know what topics you'd like to explore in future episodes. I love to hear from you and continue this conversation together. You can find me on social media at Astu Viaje Gourmet and learn more about my projects, travel experiences, and publications at tatomejia.com. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Bites and Sides. I'll see you in the next episode. If you enjoyed this episode, I invite you to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss the next ones. Also, if you think this content can inspire other travelers or food lovers, please share and comment. It's an incredible way to help more people discover this conscious way of traveling. And with that, we close today's episode. Remember that every trip, every bite, it's an opportunity to connect more deeply with the world around us. So wherever you are, don't stop exploring, tasting, and discovering, because in the end, the best way to get to know a place is by eating it. See you in the next episode. Until then, keep traveling with an open palate and heart.